Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. It is fantastic to see you coming in and joining us for this conversation. Hi, Lydia. You can see you. Hi, Firuza. I would very much appreciate if we can turn on the cameras and have the conversation. It is not just a presentation. It is always a conversation. And those of you who traced us for a while know that we love to get people engaged, ask questions, participate. It's really great to see your faces and stay engaged in the conversation. My name is Olga Ryans, and I carry multiple hats, but one of them is the life coach and career coach for busy professionals. And talking about conflict is one of my core passions for different reasons. We'll talk about this in a little bit. And also, I'm talking as the chair of the Health Staff Association group. We're talking about things that are important for the well-being of not just women, even though this is the Women's Wellness Month, but also to everyone who has place and space and impact to play in this world. And our guest today is Nadine Chapman, a fabulous Nadine, who is the goddess of mediation, I call her. Also the person who is leading the mediation services in the World Bank and also passionately engaged in conflict from different perspectives. Nadine, passing this to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Olga, and thank you for inviting me. And I see a couple of familiar faces and names. So I just want to let you know that it's really a pleasure to be here. This will be a highly interactive discussion. And to help prepare you for that, what we are going to ask is that you think for a moment about two conflicts, one conflict that you're having or have had recently in your personal life, and one conflict that you've had or are having at work. So if you could just take a moment to think about those two conflicts, a lot of what we'll be sharing with you will hopefully help you as you navigate those conflicts, or if you've already navigated them, they can serve as a lesson learned to what you've already learned from going through the conflict. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olga.
Thank you, Nadine. I would like us to start with a very basic chat conversation, and it will be actively engaging in chat. So please do type in as fast as you can. But here's the question for you. We would like to understand and make sure that you have a clarity on what is the intention that you brought in today to be here, to spend this hour with us. If you can please put in the chat, what are you hoping, intending, planning, want to gain from this conversation? So it will help us to guide the conversation a little bit more. So please put in the chat, what is your intention for participating today? Why today? Why in this conversation? And understanding and managing conflict. And while we're waiting for your responses, I would like us to highlight the title of this conversation. It's Understanding and Managing Conflict. There are lots of conversations that Nadine is running this week on conflict as part of the discussions of women and conflict at work. And they all focus kind of on the managing side of it, but we want to have a little broader conversation. What is the anatomy of the conflict? What is the relationship that we have with conflict overall? And if there is a way to see it in such a different way, reframe this conversation, reframe this relationship, so the conflict may disappear in the first place, or our relationship with this will shift from destructive and combustive to much more collaborative and constructive. And that's the intention that Nadine and I bring to this conversation today, to show us these lenses, how to see how things are different. So I'm looking into the chat. Please share your intent. Conflict in the personal relationships is damaging and seeps into all areas of life, and we need to deal with that. Thank you for sharing that. Learn how to not ruminate over issues, resolve the current conflict with a colleague. So there's a relationship, home-based and work conflict. Hoping to gain some insights that may help me handle conflict and difficult work counterparts, toxicity in work environment, differentiate conflict from having differences in views, dance with conflict. Oh, I love how that phrase. So let's dance with conflict. And more specifically, what type of dance would you put in association with conflict? Just to get this very beautiful metaphoric expression. I have mine. I'm going to hold on for a second. Nadine, what's your dance? Tango. Oh, passionate.
That's what I was thinking.
Passionate.
Tango. I was thinking tango. Someone.
Tango.
Yes.
I'm thinking waltz, and I explain why, because, and I love tango, maybe I should consider that. The waltz to me stands for lots of development and growth procedures, like a step forward and couple to the side and back. And sometimes you twirl, and sometimes you move. And sometimes you kind of fall, and other times you're very spinning on one space. So for me, waltz is a general feeling of moving forward and side and back. And as long as you keep moving, this is progress and growth and development. I love cha-cha. Cha-cha is really very passionate as well. Awesome. So with that, I would like us to also have those two conflicts in your mind. We need them because we can't be talking about the history of anything. We need to be specific to the situation that allow you to translate all these frameworks into much more actionable pieces. Because in the end of this session, we will ask you to commit to some actions that you will set for yourself, you will choose to practice, and you will take on into your world for the next week or two or the rest of your life. So with that, could you please put the ideas of what conflicts, two conflicts you have in mind that you will be pinning to all these frameworks and conversations and strategies that we'll be discussing. One from your work environment and one from your personal life. Where my personal passion is coming from to conflict. It's coming from the place that I worked with conflicts, both professionally on different levels and personally, of course, and the micro as well as macro level. I was born in the Soviet Union, the country that once used to be a peaceful place. And then back when I was just about to enter the grown-up world, it decided to fall apart. And that basically caused a tremendous distortion in social and economic and political relationships, as you can plainly see still ongoing with the ongoing conflict. But most importantly, it really broke all sorts of systems that held people together in peace and friendship. And we experienced the civil war and unrest and clashes in the societal and economic level, which ultimately translated into destructive forces that also affected many families. There was a significant increase in suicide and mental, depressive, and addictive behaviors. And ultimately, when you step into the world and the world just falls apart, think COVID and make it 10 times bigger, it's a very conflict-prone situation to grow up in that requires lots of resilience, which of course you're too young to understand at the time, but that's where the initial seeds of conflict resolution and relationship with it were seeded. In my personal life, I also went through divorce, and I went through the conflict that didn't lead to divorce and actually made the relationship stronger. As a mother of 5 kids, ages like 9 to 25, there was a fair share conflicts with my teens that give you perspectives because you start realizing there's different ways of approaching that. And on a community level, because I've been involved in cross-cultural leadership and communication training for 25 years, including in the World Bank and private sector, I'm now dealing with conflicts in the FCC countries, the high-level conflict-charged environments. In the community level, I had to deal with lots of cross-cultural miscommunication and litigation that sometimes involve child's custody and issues like that. So you could see conflict in all sorts of levels, from very simple disagreements to really drastic civil war level catastrophes. And from that grew this curiosity and interest to see if there is a way to not just influence the situation, but also see the situation from a different way. Because sometimes you feel that you're really out of control. You can't change the world. What you can change is how you perceive it. And that is my angle of where I'm coming from in this conversation. But please do feel free to interrupt with questions, with comments in the chat. This is not a presentation, it's just a guidance for us so we can have a little bit of flow in that. So I would like us to start with a very basic agenda of what we will be looking at. How the conflict relates to stress, how this affects our well-being, and what you have to do with this and what you can decide to change in it. We'll look into what causes and how it impacts us, how to move it from being destructive to constructive, and what has to do with psychology, neurology, the language and communication of the conflict. And so with that, and we'll finish up with some specific strategies and some specific ideas and resources for you. So I would like us to start with putting in the chat your perspective. What is conflict? If I were to ask you to finish the sentence, how would you finish it? Conflict is what? It's misunderstanding, divergences of opinions, feeling threatened, not being able to be on the same page. It's different views. It's uncomfortable. It's disagreement, taking different positions, misinterpretations, opposite views, strong emotions, energy, sucking energy, as well as producing that anabolistic kind of destructive charging energy, miscommunication, different points of view, draining, not being taken seriously, feeling hopeless. So let's engage a little bit more, start connecting to yourself. And you can think of this conflict in different levels. You can have your somatic intelligence, it's what the stress, the body response is telling you, like being threatened. That's the feeling that we get kind of on the body level. Emotionally, we can be angry, we can be resentful, we can be excited, we can have the curious, right? There's this emotional level. We also can have clarity on the intellectual level, is that viewing things, feeling hopeless, refusing to reach a middle ground, clashing views on events, frustration, overload, broken work-life balance. So we can all get, thank you so much for sharing, holding grudges, sharing you and participating in this. So one of the clarity that we can see that it's some sort of friction, disagreement, some sort of discord, right? So there's this there's reality, the disturbances that arises in some form of groups. And notice that groups can be external, you and other person, but sometimes it also shows up internally as me with another me having a conflict in opinions. So let's take a broader perspective. But there is the two identities that are at least or more, that there is a beliefs or actions that we somehow disagree on. And notice again the difference in actions versus beliefs and interpretation, subjectivity of that lead us, that are either resisted or unaccepted by someone else, right? Would you agree that that resonates with you? If I do, I summarize that more or less. Yes, put yes in the chat. No, if it doesn't resonate.
And I just want to jump in here to add something, because what I have found, and you all are right on point, and Olga, I think the thumbs up to the group. What I have found is usually when I do training, 9 times out of 10, when we are asked to describe conflict, it's always negative. You know, it's always destructive. It's always disturbing or friction and angst. But what I have found, and what we will give you an opportunity to see during the course of our engagement with you, is that conflict can also be the fuel to your car. And when I look back on my life, like Olga, I went through a divorce as well, and I have teenage girls, which is not easy. But what I have found is that sometimes once we get through the fire, we come out transformed in some ways. So while conflict is uncomfortable, there are positive outcomes that can come through it or out of it. And we're going to talk about that. So thank you, Olga. I'll turn it back over to you.
And I would love to take Nadine's comment a touch further even so. If we really, really decide to look at conflicts, we can realize, put two people together and there's an opportunity for disagreement. Would you agree with that? And if this is the case, then maybe conflict is not the enemy at all. It's just like sunshine comes and then the moon comes, and then the sunshine comes and then the moon comes. And there is no issues with the night or the winter coming after sort of season. So two people together, two opinions together create instant possibility to either see this as a conflict and disagreement, or a mosaic of opinions and diversity of options. And that is the first little shift that we decide. Only you can decide how you decide to see the conflict, right? So it's a decision, as I always say, it's always starts with a decision, it's a commitment. What if conflict would have been just a mosaic of opinions that is here for me to see what I'm not seeing? Who would like to see more in life? What if I decide that interesting, there's something for me to learn from? And just that language with yourself will immediately start shifting the shifts and changes in the perspective. Conflict is a big word, but let's shrink it. Conflict is really not about a person. It comes in relationships. We identify that. Two people together, voila, you set yourself a landscape for possibility of divergence and opinions. And this is not necessarily against the person, but often because of the values that we are, for some reason, are not aligned. No, we're not taught in any school or academy of life how to talk or even understand our values, yet alone people's values around us, including people we spend life with, like spouses and kids. And yet values are driving our interpretation in a very subjective way, very powerfully through pretty much every fundamental activities in life daily. And the third piece is this interest in resources, is this perception that someone is violating your interest or not understanding your interest, and or somehow will squeeze you out of the resources, whatever they might be. Like in the global scale, we will fight for water, but sometimes we can fight for time as a resource or energy that is limited. So Nadine, I don't know if you want to comment on any of those components here before we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Olga. And I do think that a lot of you in your comments, you had shared exactly what Olga is talking about as far as your values, dealing with someone that you think is difficult. Someone had mentioned dealing with someone who's pushy or who doesn't allow you to communicate. I think someone put that in the chat. Work-life balance is a value that we're hearing from a few of you as something that creates conflict or generates conflict. But I do want to have us take a little bit of a step backwards. We do often have conflict within ourselves. And what I find is that we often are trained to look outside of ourselves. And I think I've written about this as, you know, we often turn the mirror away from us instead of looking at ourselves. So one thing that I really encourage you to do is when you reflect on the conflict that you thought about, is to really think about what role did you play, because it takes two to tango. And often we're triggered by people and situations that remind us of something that was painful that we haven't fully resolved. So that would be my addition to what is here.
And the importance of value, I'd like to we will come back to this a bit later, but for example, cultural differences, great deal in the global economy. The way we experience respect or how we trained to see respect, for example, could be significantly different from culture to culture. And whether you recognize or not recognize in this, what some people will consider to be aggressive behavior could be an assertive and positive behavior. Like a man is supposed to be from day one, they train to be the boys, they need to be aggressive. And it's almost like societal programming or a box that they have to show certain way of behavior to be properly man. Similarly for women, it could be very different, because for women, the assertive behavior could be taken as very aggressive and it's considered to be inappropriate, even though it's exactly the same behavior that you would expect. So there's a culture of gender, there's a culture of societal norms, but also the culture of communication. In French and German and Russian cultures, being authentically expressive of what you feel, say what you feel, say what you see, whether this is positive or negative, that's considered to be overall a positive value of direct authentic communication. Taking this to, let's say, American sandwich, which is a little bit softer. It's when you kind of say yes, and then you a little bit criticize, but then you sort of finish up on the positive again. And compare this to some maybe Asian countries that are completely not allowing this direct attack of any kind. It's considered to be inappropriate behavior, right? So we can see a very different behavior. So perception of what is at play could be very different depending where you're standing and looking from within yourself. And start seeing whether these two conflicts we identify for yourself in the beginning of this conversation are really related to relationships or perhaps values, or maybe there is an interest, a resource confrontation a little bit, or trying to get to this. And let's add to this 3 more pieces. It could be related to the process instead of a person. It will be related to the process. How you do this and how I do this or expect to do this would be different. So it's not you, Nadine, necessarily that is a horrible person. It's just the process that you're doing this, maybe in disagreement with me, right? There's also the task, like there is a particular task that you might be seeing one way while I see it in a very different way. So for example, I don't know, washing dishes and doing laundry for me at home will be completely irrelevant. Like, I don't care. And so I can do this, don't do it. My husband will do this. Someone else, my kids will do this. It doesn't really matter. Well, for some person, not having a tidy home is the matter of almost identity crisis. And therefore, this task has a significantly different value to the person, right? To take it from the everyday life activities, similar at work. And finally, there is an opinion and issue that we often associate with a person, and we take this conflict against the person. Well, the issue is really opinion or issue, right? They say never talk about what? Sex, religion, and what else was the third piece that you never should, on politics.
Politics, yes.
Right, so what the first kind of mini thing, like a layer, peeling the onion of your conflict. So I'd like you to put in the chat, if you can, from this perspective, anything that is peeling off a little bit for you, whether you recognize that that big bully person that you have issues with might not be the bully person, but it's actually one of those 6 pieces. And granted, this is just the beginning of this discovering the iceberg. There's way more, but at least this much. And put in the chat if there's any clarity that has started coming through you when you look at your conflict from this. And know that relationship and value are the most subjective. They're very much depends on your perspective. So let's go with the chat. We start realizing that some values are coming up. By the way, there's a research by Oxford Business School, the Said Business School, that shows that values is the most energy consuming disagreement context with people, and probably the least recognized by both of us, both participants of this. But why this is important? Couple things. It's a perspective, first and foremost. Whatever is the situation, we sometimes blow out of proportion because how we perceive it. So there's the perception, which then translates into the myriads of issues that we consistently surround with, which can create that anxiety loop, right? Because if you have disagreements with this and tasks and values and people, and it becomes really very quickly quite unmanageable. And most importantly, it creates this internal feeling that there's something wrong with you, me, there's an identity issue, and the stories we start telling ourselves about inner self and or about other person. And this literally is the elephant in the room, because conflicts are inevitable. Because if you have 2 people, you have the ecosystem for conflict right there, or diversity. So it shows up literally in every area of life. And I just love those pictures. So I'm going to share them with you because they are staying in your memory. If you see the elephant in your relationship, or you see the feeling that you are now not really connecting with anyone and actually removing yourself from relationship, or you find yourself that there is something charging you at work, I would like you to start recognizing you cannot avoid and escape conflict. It is absolutely present with you and within you, whether you like it or not. So instead of trying to avoid it, it's like fighting the shadow. Let's start looking into the sun and see how we can change the sunlight so the shadow will change and have the dynamic relationship with the shadow, right? So my invitation to you, put in the chat if you're willing to play with this. What if conflict is just a shadow and there is an opportunity of the light that we need to start playing with, and we're willing to look that way instead, just for the next 50 minutes. So what does it mean for us? It means that instead of big bully conflict, which we really can't manage and swallow, we're dealing with communication gap, understanding, maybe some egos sometimes, which generally are coming from the place of some needs. We'll talk about them. Maybe unclear objectives, maybe frustrations, maybe some lack of trust, maybe lack of collaborative environment, maybe indecisiveness or procrastination. And if this is so, you can start seeing how the solutions are immediately started knocking on the door, right? If this is just a misunderstanding, what can we do about that? Communicate. If we are looking into all of this, one of the components I would like to bring us together, recognizing that all these mini tiny conflicts eventually build up into work and life areas, but ultimately it's us within that decide that approach to this. And that's why we not necessarily need to recognize the difference between them. That's why it's not a separate conversation, but rather the conversation about how we feel inside when we feel being attacked and the level of safety that we are able to create, because it's that inner child within us that is consistently crying for help, ultimately. And it's the same inner child of someone else hiding behind their behavior in their behavior, in their choices of words. And if we start seeing that as the possibility that it's just that inner unrealized, emotionally not mature behavior sometimes that translates in our perspective of an experience of life.
I think this is very powerful. I have found myself in conflict recently. I had a conflict with a healthcare provider. I was going to physical therapy, and the therapist, she was running late. I was waiting in the room often for 30 minutes, waiting for her. And it really upset me because I had taken time off from my job. I drove to Georgetown of Washington, D.C., for those of you who are not from Washington on the call. And I felt very disrespected. I felt that my value of respect of my time was being violated. And also they weren't communicating to me. And what ended up happening is after the third time this happened, I disconnected that relationship entirely and told them I can no longer go there. And she said, I wish you had said something to me. You could have come out of the room and told me, and they would have told you. And I do this for a living. So, Olga and I are telling you to do all these wonderful things, but the reality of it is we are all imperfect beings and we all have values. And the only takeaway I have for you is that timely communication can prevent the break of a relationship. I think that if I had been more timely and recognized not only that she had her own stress and I had my own stress, I would not be looking for a new physical therapist. So just be aware of that. Also be aware of the little child in you, not only the little child in them, but who is the little girl in you? And what attention did she not get? What are her frustrations? Because often those little girl frustrations manifest themselves outwardly in your relationships.
And we'll be diving a little bit into this, how exactly this works through you. So you have an opportunity to explore that little inner child within you who is reacting in that stress situations that we identified. But I would also like to point to two important things. If you feel that there is a stress and a significant stress, and we're talking about up to 25% of people feeling significantly bullied at work. This is statistics that just shocks you. It's like adult people bullying each other all the time, just like little kids on the playground. But it does have a tremendous economic and financial impact on the organizations as well. So if you're managing, or if you're considering that it's not important what you feel, you can bring it to attention of your management because it has significant impact on the ultimate ability of the organization to support you and function as big economy. We're talking about 77% of people being chronically stressed, close to 120,000 people dying annually from work-related stress and conflict. This is the price that is impossible to comprehend sometimes, if you think of that. And ultimately, not going into any of this in details, translated into billions of dollars, just to understand the components of how this shows up in your personal productivity and performance, which affects your career, affects your relationships, as well in the overall company thing. And if people say, well, then we just need to avoid conflicts, I would like us to invite the final piece of this. Avoiding conflict doesn't take it away. It only puts you in that spiral in the carousel. It's like riding the carousel over and over and hoping that you will be miles away. You're on the horse that goes up and down, but it still stays in the carousel. It results into high level of chronic stress, broken careers, paths, and relationships. And 85% of us feeling and dealing with conflict at work. That means pretty much every single person that you either are or know has something to do with that. So instead of trying to win that war somehow, let's start building this mosaic of peace with couple frameworks that hopefully you will translate into your examples that we're having. And so we can start playing with that. So if you were to build that piece, the conflict, what would it look like to you? Right? It's an ability to govern conflict. So there's an understanding and how to go through this. There's a peaceful means of doing this, and we'll be looking into this a lot in the last second of the workshop. There is a growth component. Just Nadine was talking about what if conflict is there for you to break out of that old skin into the new self. And there is a ability to see it as a contrast, as a diversity. I call it the mosaic of conflict. And it's an extension to what you can do, like kaleidoscope. You could see this as the broken glass pieces, or you can start putting different angles and mirrors, and suddenly becomes an enormously beautiful kaleidoscope visage of opportunities to see beautiful things in it. And finally, it's an opportunity to see perspectives. So if that resonates, put in the chat, how much you agree with this concept of a peace instead of war in a conflict relationship? Resonates with Feruza, I can see that. There are 4 areas that we experience life. The body, somatics, that's neurological feelings. There is a stress, we communicate with this, and that drives lots of our reactive behaviors until we stop. There is a psychology, the intellectual cognitive approach to this, and we'll be looking at a couple frameworks. There is a social intelligence, which combines the 2 things, as your perceptions, your expectations of other people, your culture, your societal family programs, and then there is a spiritual concept. I'm here against the world, or the world is one and friendly, and I just didn't see the past, but now I will start seeing this because we're one and we're serving this together, right? So those like different levels of looking through perspectives. And the first one I would like us to bring in, I teach this every time in every course, we go straight to pursue. Trigger, action, trigger, action. What if there is 3 more steps before? Pause. You're here today because you pause and you're talking, you're looking into this. It's not necessarily jump and solve. It's to give yourself an opportunity to just give space, whether this is in general or specific conflict. Instead of jumping back to your spouse or your manager, you can park it and ask, let's reschedule for Tuesday, let's sit down and talk. Well, let's talk 3 hours later, right? It's the creating that space, pause. It's being in the present, which means seeing different perspectives, seeing this mosaic before you form your final opinion. There's planning, which is a strategic way of preparing for conversations. The more complex the conversation, the more strategically you should be approaching that. And Nadine is absolutely the goddess in figuring this out for us. So hopefully we'll see that. And only then you can go into strategic pursuit of your plan. And so there's that peaceful, structured way of approaching conflict. Nadine, if you have any comments on that or would like to add to it.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about what we're talking about, and it really resonates to me on many levels, and hopefully to you too. And I think the critical point is the pausing. We tend to move and work, and a lot of World Bank staff are type A personalities, so we're used to production and producing, and we're not always very good at pausing and stopping and assessing where we are, not only in our relationship with other people, but in our relationship to our own bodies. And it's something that we really need to make a conscious effort to do. Sometimes we're working so hard that we disconnect from our bodies, and that creates disease and discomfort and stress and conflict. So I do think it's very important to pause and to be present in your space and to create artificial boundaries for yourself that you can operate in every day to help minimize the occurrence of conflict.
And just to compare this to how we also have an experience of actually seeing it in a different way. We do have a concept of disagreement, which does not escalate to conflict in our mind, right? And we see this as a bit more transparent. I disagree on this, you disagree on that. There is a content that we focus on instead of personalities. And then there is this maybe argumentation trying to influence the person's behavior. But then we get to conflict, we somehow lose that ability to stay in a bit more neutral part, because a second way applies as conflict to our mentality. We frame this into strong feelings, various assumptions, which we're not mind readers, but often people assume that somehow they know that Nadine is value time. The doctor may not even be aware that Nadine is waiting in the room. So it's like an assumption that she needs to know, and an assumption that she has this respect, and then an assumption that someone does this because they woke up today with intent to go and hurt you, right? It's just this assumptions that are the horror of the stories that we create. There's a misunderstanding, personal values, and most importantly, it's directed on the identity. So coming back to this idea why we do certain things, and this is very important to start recognizing. So if you were to take that story that you have been from the beginning coming with, recognizing that there is different needs, and those needs will have a particular effect, how important they will be on different times in life. The Maslow, very famous Maslow hierarchy of needs, telling us that when people perceive that you're going against their safety, they will be much more aggressive and reactive to this behavior if the perception is on a different level. So are you much more reactive to certain things when you perceive that it somehow affects the lower levels of your needs. And that is probably one of the most powerful places of understanding. So in the situation that you were thinking of from the beginning, try to recognize what levels of defense was triggered in you from this perspective, if you were just to look from this needs perspective and pyramid. For example, Nadine, in this situation with the doctor, what do you think was triggering you?
What I think was really triggering me was my needs were not being met. As far as feeling respect, I felt that I wasn't being respected. That goes, I guess, interestingly enough, into the esteem. I felt disrespected. I felt that my time was not valued by the doctor or her staff. And that fed into my psychological need, which was I think I was hungry, which is never a good thing, I must say, because when I'm hungry, I'm not very pleasant. So if I were honest, looking back,
Nadine.
and I was sleep deprived. So I think that also fed into my mindset. So there were
fantastic. So notice that it's just a whole paradigm of things that can be stacking on top of each other, but it comes from the place of disrespect, very value kind of charged emotionally for us, and then it fed into physiological concept. And I would say there's also probably the resources. Time is a very valuable resource. It's hugely valuable resource. It translates to taking time from something else that you can make money for, or give it to your kids or someone important to you. So there's at least 3 levels that were violated in Nadine's perspective. Yesterday, I had my 11-year-old who was sick, and we have this upcoming vacation, and she decided, so it's really important not to get sick for us. But she decided to just go, like, not naked, but literally almost naked outside for a walk, which was just, I blew up, totally blew up. And so I'm trying to understand, like, it was a respect, like I told you not to, and she violated this respect. But there was this, I think it was mostly in this physiological safety place, because it was the physical survival and my frustration that I somehow didn't protect her. I didn't watch, I was working, I didn't pay attention. She escaped as if it's my responsibility. When you're 11, you should be able to survive. But it was that feel of guilt that is, I didn't do enough, right? So, and that basically comes into that place very often to recognize why we're blowing up and what's the conflict is about. Another important concept is to understand how we build up and where to interrupt yourself, because there is a fantastic way of catching this. So here's the goal that you're working on and you're generally going through, and there is something interrupts this, which the first initial reaction you're going to have is that physical feeling of anger, some sort of reaction inside. That's a big physiological reaction that initially will kick in before any thoughts and emotions and your actions will go forward. And then we generally go into thinking through this, right? So we push the brake. If someone cuts you off, then you get this emotional reaction of fear, anger, and then you start thinking, oh my gosh, what would happen if something would have happened? And then it goes into the outcome. So this is like a very basic neurology of conflicts that we experience in our life in general. And the point here is that when we get into that story, say, this spiral, we start getting into what initially kicks in an amygdala level of stress, survival, basic survival, danger, survive. And then we get into the place where we start bringing the story in and explaining this, either the way we want it to go one way or another way. So very, very basic idea would be that there's some autopilot behavior. We're fine. We're doing the same, working on the project. And then some trigger kicks in, which is quite unique for every single person. And then we have this alert reaction. And this is what the initial and the only cause of stress really is, which lasts like 90 seconds according to science. After that, we get into interpretation and story, which then triggers our response and maintaining and ruminating and staying in that worry that can then last for hours, days, weeks, months, and for some people for years. So clarity between what is the initial cost and what was the time frame for that? 90 seconds. And translating this into this maintaining that cost and staying in that place for the remaining of the time is the place where we can interrupt and stop and take it from interpretation into the worry and stress to interpretation of different kind to a different solutions and different decisions. So this is what I call the neurology of conflict in general. So what's the formula? Number one, take your story that you're just thinking about and put it in the chat and just start working with me. So what really happened? What was the facts? In Nadine's situation, for example, the facts were she came to the appointment that was scheduled and she had to wait 30 minutes. Facts. The fact was Nadine was hungry. She didn't have lunch. And she didn't sleep that day. So she was probably not in the best place physiologically. That's the facts. But then came the story in Nadine, right? How they disrespect. She intentionally did that. She woke up at 7 a.m. thinking how exactly she's going to ruin my day. And their story just keeps taking because we're machines that make meanings. That's what humans are all about. The second component here is the intent. What was the intent of this doctor? Was the intent really sitting there and then just figure out how to make Nadine mad and angry? Or maybe she was busy with another client that had some heart attack issue and situation, and it was important at that moment. There are cultural differences. There's some intent, time specific, which is very common to Anglo-Saxon cultures, Germanic cultures in general. Time matters. So if the stop has to happen at 60 minutes, then we stop. And then there are relational cultures, like Eastern cultures. Russian culture is one of them, where it doesn't matter when we stop, as long as the project is not completed, we will stay in this relationship because that is more important. And so could be that the doctor was more important to finish the heart attack patient situation than to stick to exact rules and show up at 9:15 for Nadine. So there is that intent that you want to start questioning. Was the intent to really ruin your life in the conflict situation? Or was the intent of some different nature? In conflict, people don't necessarily come with intent to ruin your life. That's one rule that is golden, right? Nadine, have you ever in your experience seen a person who intentionally woke up thinking, how can I ruin life of 7 more people today? Then there is the my investment, and Nadine pointed to this very nicely. What is my role in this? You play a role in every single thing. There's always we. And your role could be tiny, but there's always a role. How you showed up in any form of conversation is always a defining and the only controllable by you element in this formula. Then the second whole thing, so we're moving from logic into feeling and emotional intelligence and compassionate alternatives. What is the feeling that you're experiencing? Recognizing them, knowing that, oh, I feel angry. So there are 3 ways you can respond to things. And I'm curious, thinking of your situation, there are 3 emotional responses. I'll show them because you're feeling angry or agitated or somehow resistant. The second one would be avoiding because you feel fear of some sort. Oh my gosh, what if they will fire me if I don't do this? Then what will happen? Right? There's a fear, insecurity that comes back to your own needs and insecurities, this inner child within kind of like shrinking. And then the third one is a place of, curious, wow, Nadine has this interesting perspective. It's like my husband usually, he eats the pies that are horrible and he would say, what an interesting pie. Honestly, can say I've never tried anything like this before. It's like a curiosity moment. I'm curious what they think about. So what do you say in your situation, your initial reaction? Is that more of the fight, flight, aggressive? Would it be more of avoidance? Or would it be more of curiosity and interested in? So for example, taking my place, my situation that I shared yesterday with my daughter, it was definitely coming from the place of fear for her safety more than anything else. And fear that I'm a horrible mom. It wasn't aggressive. It was that fear that was shrinking. But I went for aggressive response to this, right? It wasn't the curiosity, even though it could have been. And then the final piece is very important to understand is that element of identity. Is it you that is being attacked? And the language that we choose. It's something against me, right? I am not the person who does this. I am not the one. How dare you tell me that I am the person? It's this you conversation that we choose to have. You always do this. You never do this. Right? One of the important components is to really understand the arc of the stress response that we have in our body. This is a neurology of the conflict. We do need stress. Stress is a very natural response to some sort of request for energy. So it's coming literally for anything that you want to do beyond sitting on the sofa. So by itself, stress is not a problem. It's a positive and wonderful mechanism that allows us to become superhumans when we need it on demand. The problem becomes when we stretch too far, and instead of relaxing back into relaxation, we go too far into fatigue, exhaustion, and eventually into the place of a burnout. So with the 77% of people showing the symptoms or reporting or self-evaluating themselves as the highly stressed or moderately stressed, this is a significant issue to consider that we might just be in the place where reactivity and stress response is taking over our usual control functions. versus the place where we stay in the optimal place of being focused, motivated, and in the healthy tension situation. And so when we get into the stress response, we really go into very famous fight, flight, and sympathetic response where we really go into attack. It's a defensive and survival mode. Or we go into freeze and faint response where we stay in the place of avoiding and stopping, waiting, and not spending energy. While the alternative, of course, would be the resilient and resourceful state, being in the parasympathetic state where we are in the place of the highest executive functions, higher performance, higher ability to manage our emotions. And when we talk about those things, you can kind of look into some of the symptoms and identify very easily where you seem to be handing out more percentage of time. You can also see where you can see reactions that other people may have, whether it's your partner, spouse, children, employees, colleagues, and recognize that sometimes what we take personally as an offense could actually be coming from the place of being in a stress response for different reasons. So that gives us a little bit of humility and a little bit of compassion sometimes. Why is that important? Well, there's a certain mechanism, I call it the conflict stress loop, and it works from the beginning of the stress or balance where the body has an initial reaction, and then it gets propelled by the thoughts we make up in our head, which then cause the certain emotions, anxiety or fear or anger, that then take us to the place of making decisions on acting or not acting, saying or not saying certain things. And that in turn translates into either escalation or resolution of stress, some sort of outcome. And that outcome in turn kicks back into the stress or balance response, and the loop continues going around. So the importance of this mechanism is to know that at any given moment, at any given time, whether you recognize you're in an emotional place or there are thoughts that are your inner thoughts, inner conversation you have, or there are certain actions that you are aware of, you can interrupt this. And remembering that there is that Maslow pyramid of needs somewhere behind. There's some need that is perceived to be violated. And so the conversation can be interrupted pretty much at any given time. Whether you recognize that you're in a stress response or there are some thoughts that are panicky or getting a little bit like in the conversation gets really active, or there's some emotions that you recognize and that you're experiencing, or you notice your actions and ultimately the outcome. So this is a very powerful circle of wellness, stress, and conflict that you can always recognize in yourself as well as in others. It's very interesting and important is to remember that conflicts are not about people, it's about something else beyond people. And common causes of conflict would be something like organizational structure, resources, competing for resources, how we perceive independence and authority over certain tasks. There could be incompatible goals or values that we might be clashing without recognizing that. There are personality differences that are just making some more aligned and less aligned in teamwork. And most importantly, usually there is a communication problem that we can easily identify and strategically shift and change in a predictable way, changing the outcomes of the conflict. Some of the most common causes of conflict at the workplace would be, again, the communication gap, the lack of understanding, clash of egos takes us to personality clashes, sometimes unclear objectives, frustrations, lack of trust, lack of collaborative environment, indecisiveness, just to name a few. All of them, if you notice, have an opportunity to be resolved in a strategic way if we identify them, because to each of them we can come up with particular tactics. Another important framework that I would like you to keep in mind when you approach conflict is the conflict management styles. We do differ in the way we perceive or trained or programmed through our cultural or societal or familial upbringing. how we perceive and value assertiveness on one side versus the cooperativeness. Some cultures are much more focused on the task, performance, and accomplishments, while other cultures may be significantly overvalue the cooperativeness and the community unity in among the members of the group. So it's very important to understand where your perception puts you in that framework, and where do you think the person who you have in conflict situation may be falling into. So important ones would be the avoiding. This is the approach, the mentality of lose-lose. I will lose, they will lose. There's no reason to go into conflict. Conflict is bad and there is nothing in it. So that's probably the most critical place of lose-lose approach. The other two, the accommodating and the competing side, they kind of a little bit of extremes, but they all coming from the place that there is one party that will lose and one party that will win. In the accommodating style, you will find more winning, yielding to another party, to the person that you're dealing with. One in the competing place, it's a my way, highway type of approach, but either one of those is generally very igniting and overall do not lead to constructive way of resolving the situation. Probably one of the most dangerous beliefs that I often see when I work with coach my clients, I see the concept of a compromise, which is often perceived as a positive thing. But the compromise is when you have a little bit of a win and a little bit of a giving up something, and there is no clear satisfaction in this agreement ultimately, because there is a feeling of some sort of resentment and unfinished business. Well, the most successful ways of approaching conflict would be the collaborating style, where both parties win, where there is a negotiation, when there is a strategic way to arrive into the solutions that I call we mentality, where we find the way, and both parties can grow through these alternative solutions that may be a third way of coming up with the decision that satisfies both parties. Another very important element in understanding conflict would be the communication styles. Roughly speaking, we can identify 4 of them that most commonly can be viewed, and they do fall into the concept of respect for yourself and respect for others. Now, the first one that you probably will see very often is the passive one, which is showing a greater respect for others, but dismissing your own values often. And we see this in the people pleasing and the self-wellness sacrifice component. It's that serving others before yourself, dismissing your mind, your energy, feeling not important, feeling that your needs and values or interests are not valuable enough, that your time and energy can be stepped on, and there is a feeling overall that I lose, they win. The second very clearly identifiable piece is the aggressive behavior, which is very easy to see. Obviously, it's my way, highway, it's bullying behavior, but we often see this in the leadership approaches from the past, but kind of translating this into the present as well, and surprisingly in parenting styles. It's the conversation where I said so, I'm right, you're wrong, let me teach you. There's lots of teaching, lots of advising, and solicited advice often, and sometimes playing a very active and aggressive behavior. So it's a concept of I win, you lose. And passive aggressive, which is probably the most common style in many people that I can get to work with. It's kind of coming from the place of you don't want to comply, but you also want to avoid the conflict. So you kind of hesitantly agree to, but then you expressing in some ways, whether it's through your body language or linguistically, language-wise, expressing some sort of dismissal to or disrespect to the process. And it's compliant but with hesitation. It's softly resenting and resisting something. And it shows up in the form of gossiping and sarcastic jokes, microaggressive comments, which really is a low respect to other people because you don't really want to do this, but it's also low respect for yourself. And finally, the most positive and probably the only positive way of addressing or in communication is really being in assertive mode when you have clear, respectful expression of what you want and what you need, which you really need to understand this first of all for yourself. Setting certain boundaries, and boundaries don't come naturally to anyone. It's a skill that comes with practice and practice and practice. And it's not just about saying no, but also being comfortable with receiving no, or at least being able to stay with the no of others and not take it personally and shift into one of those aggressive or passive behaviors. And a big deal of emotional intelligence, tolerating those uncomfortable emotions instead of trying to avoid them or kill them or shift them into positivity. And that's ultimately the place of the win-win mindset, the we approach to relationships. And finally, important is also to understand that conflicts do not just erupt out of nowhere. They're like volcanoes that kind of have the seismic activity that you can predict, you can measure, you can sense, you can feel. So it's important to understand that there's stages of conflict and notice that there is a latent conflict where it's kind of a brewing ground, the conflict of landscape, I call it sometimes. The trigger could be a particular situation, but it's usually not the place where the conflict is born. It's just the igniting moment. It's a little spark that brings the dry wood into the big fire. And so it's important to understand the triggers and important to manage them, but even more so important is to understand this latent conflict. Finally, when the conflict does arrive, it is not the place to start necessarily solving it. It's best to let it kind of burn out a little bit to serve the conflict wave during the acute conflict and then come back proactively to the resolution of the conflict when the emotions are a little bit less active and where there is an ability to have strategic approach to this conversation. And then finally, not doing this alone, getting the support, and really not trying to solve everything by yourself, because the hero journey, as fantastic as it might be, is really not the most productive way sometimes. So there are different strategies, there are different systems that could be supportive, anything from mediation and conflict resolution systems in the office to coaching and practicing in strategic approach to your difficult conversations outside of that. And it's really important to understand that there is a logic in this. You can sense the conflict, have some conflict management strategies, and then evaluate the outcome, and then apply different solutions next time until you find the one that really resolves the problem. You can also anticipate conflicts and have the time and place set, this pause, present, plan, pursue process to diagnose and define the conflict, find different lenses, see if there is a different way to reframe the conflict, and identify alternative solutions and move into the place of we and win-win mentality, as well as finding the language to communicate it to others. And to finish up this quick review of all the fantastic different frameworks that we discussed, again, in the context of remembering that loop of how the stress, thoughts, emotion, action, and reaction work together, and recognizing that there is this deep needs that we all have, whether it's you or the person you're dealing with. From that place, we can start thinking about constructive learning and growing through conflict. So first, an important thing to understand that many of us never got the role modeling for the successful conflict behavior, and it is essential to find someone who is successful in that, or work with a coach or a mentor for support strategy and practice, practice, practice. And also remembering the conflict perception formula. threat minus safety equals danger, which will trigger the reaction. And from here, we go back into this loop of stress, thought, emotion, action, and reaction. So notice and recognize first and foremost when you're triggered. Listen to your body, recognize your stress response, and then feel what was this trigger. Knowing it will strategically help you prevent or eliminate future conflicts. The second thing we want to do is to recognize the facts and separate them from the story, from the meaning we assign to them. The fact that she was late 10 minutes does not necessarily mean that she was disrespectful to me. It just means that she was late 10 minutes. The disrespect is the meaning you assign to this. The third step would be to recognize your attitude. Think of this in three forms. Are you in the bucket of, okay, well, I'll show you? Or you're in the bucket of avoid conflict at all costs? Or you fall into the bucket of, I'm curious, hey, let's discuss. There will be three very different attitudes that will initially shape and reframe your conflict in a very different way. What category of emotions do you feel are mostly prevalent when you think of this conflict situation? I ask you to think about at the beginning of this workshop. They will fall into the place of aggressive or avoidant or receptive and curious. When you're in an aggressive place, your reaction are going to be mostly coming from the place of irritation, right? It will be much more fight-flight type of reaction. The avoidant will likely feel more of a fear of being dismissed or rejected or disapproved, and guilt. That's the place that we're trying to avoid those uncomfortable emotions. And then receptive would be curiosity, would be interested to know more. The fifth stop would be the quick thinking, taking this to the context of a logic. What could be the intent that they had? No one is waking up every morning thinking how to make you miserable today. So it could have been the intent that they had was separate from the form in which it was delivered. And so maybe you didn't recognize or did respond to the form, but the intent itself probably was in some positive way that we can think it that way. And then we want to understand if there are any needs or interests that may have been overstepped and perceived as threatened or endangered, because we remember this formula that threat minus safety equals danger, and it causes us to react. So if we start thinking from the place of intent, needs, and interest, we might start recognizing that there are some lenses that we can shift and start reframing the conflict situation just in the form of a disagreement. The sixth step would be to understand the mindset and kind of run into this question. Am I in a win-win place or am I in a lose-win situation? Where am I on the we versus I and you? Where is the contradiction versus cooperation, collaboration? And remember, in the culture differences and societal programs, men, women, older, younger people, will have a significant place sometimes. So we need to also stop back and think, what if it's just a cultural perspective? Germans and French and Russians will be much more direct, while for the many Asian cultures, the direct response would be completely inappropriate and unacceptable. And very important is to recognize that no one is born great negotiators and conversationalists. We all have the skill that we can develop, and having difficult conversation has a strategy that you can learn, you can plan, and you can always practice and practice and practice until it becomes your second nature. Also important is to understand the language you use, even speaking to yourself about the conflict. It's these things about I'm stupid, he is aggressive, he is a bully, he's a narcissist. All of those conversations that we use in our language will charge us more or relax us into a different perspective. So what language could be used? The very general formula would be something to stay away from you language and stay with the I. Very specific on the situation instead of you always do this, you never do this. The third element will be this focusing on specific behavior or words instead of the person. It's not like you're aggressive, but you said this, and that, and I felt it was disrespectful to me. Staying out of the identity threats of any kind, like you are the stupid one or you are the bully, and talking instead about your feelings. I felt angry when you did X. And then pausing and listening, which is absolutely important because we often never really stop talking. And if we do, we're not listening. We're preparing the next attack in our head and thinking how we're going to rebut them. So if we put it all together, the statement that you would like to start playing with will be sounding something like, I feel angry or I feel disrespected when you said this and that, as I interpret this as you don't care for my feelings. And then you pause and then you listen. They might explain things. They might come up with a different alternative that you don't even think about. And then you can continue with an alternatives. I would appreciate if you could do this or this or this instead. And so this gives them an opportunity to not just feel stuck with the problem, but also see the potential of solutions that they may continue working on in the future.
And we have a couple of questions in the chat also. And I also want to talk briefly about the internal options that are available to staff. Lydia had asked, how do you deal with conflict in the family when the other party doesn't acknowledge your feelings, emotions with regards to the reason, I guess, you're in conflict? And I think, Lydia, that's a really good question. I mean, how do you deal with someone who is not willing to acknowledge your emotions? I think one technique that I have used when I feel that I'm being ignored emotionally is to speak to it, to actually tell the person that I have a need for them to acknowledge what I'm experiencing, whether they agree with it or not, and the impact that their ignoring of your feelings is having on you. Ultimately, we can't change anybody but ourselves. But what I have found very useful is to talk to people about their behavior and the impact that it's having on you. So in this conversation, it could be, every time I tell you that I'm angry, you laugh or you roll your eyes. And that makes me feel that you don't value our relationship. And if they're not willing to respect you, then you really need to evaluate that relationship, even if it's family, and you may need to set boundaries around you. So that would be my advice with that. I think there was another question. I can't, I'm just looking quickly.
Nadine, I can help you with that.
Yes, please.
So Carla is asking, how can you, again, I think it's related to that. How can you create a space for a conversation when one of the parties is unwilling to engage? They behave in a ghosting manner or acting defensive.
I mean, I will tell you, it's actually a good time for me to talk briefly about what I do in the area of conflict. What I always recommend is that you try to deal with the person directly, that you try to get them to engage you. However, if you're unable to do that, if it is a work conflict, you can go to mediation. You can go to my office and you can request to have a third-party neutral sit down with you and that other person and have a conversation. The staff rule requires that if you request mediation, that they are required to at least attend an intake session and one session with you. So I find it very helpful sometimes to bring in either a mediator or a trusted third party, someone that you both respect and someone who can help break the impasse between you. It doesn't have to be mediation, but try to speak to the person. Speak to them when you think they are also ready. A mistake that I've seen people make is, I'm ready to talk, so you're going to listen to me. That is about you. It's not about them. So always try to find a time and a place that's appropriate for both of you. And someone mentioned Will Smith. That's a great example of someone who was triggered, and instead of pausing, he acted out of anger, and I think now probably has a great deal of remorse. Linda, you have a question?
Yes, more like an advice request. I know about this last part regarding the body language. In my case, I think that's something that can avoid delivering the message, because I'm someone that feels that we need to agree to disagree, be respectful, I love what you said before, Nadine, like it takes two to tango. I try to recognize my role on whatever happened. But culturally, there are a lot of barriers because people tend to think that denying or avoiding is the best option. And if you don't do that, it's like you are the problem, you are the conflict. And in my case, for some reason, my body language, I know that's my problem. I don't know how to solve it. When I'm probably sad or anxious or nervous, I tend to smile, and I'm doing it right now as I'm speaking. And the same happened with other emotions. So people look at me and probably don't understand. Probably they think that I'm mocking, that I'm doing something that is not really how I feel, and that creates misunderstandings and adds up to the problem. Because when I'm trying to solve the things, they think I'm not sincere. And unfortunately, in my country, these kind of things, the help that I need for these issues with my body language, we don't have that kind of support. There are no places where you can go to get help. There is someone that actually told me, and I tend to believe that I might have some spectrum thing in my behavior. I don't know, maybe I am an INTJ, probably that my personality doesn't
Linda,
help
I can,
that much.
if I can step into this from the
Sure.
cross-cultural leadership, 25 years of experience. It's exactly what we've been teaching people working through cultures. So one way of absolutely strongly recommend you explore is to bring what you have is a high context situation when you assume that your behavior will be understood by the culture carriers, right? In the situation where we are, we need to bring it down to very low context, which means you saying and communicating very specifically, not just what you want, but also the environment you frame in the conversation. So I'll give you an example. You can say that I am smiling because this is how I generally feel, but I feel this and I have these ideas and I feel this reaction when you say this. And so even though I'm smiling, I feel this. You bring in this down from their interpretation and assumptions of what your smile might mean, because for them, smile might mean one thing, and for you, culturally, it's a very different thing. And you bring it down to explaining. First, we're going to be talking about good things. Then we're going to talk about some criticism. And then we're going to finish with some other good things and steps how we can grow. That's kind of a sandwich conversation. When I explain how things will happen, then we go into conversation. And then we have the conversation. So when you have these cultural components and you suspect there is a difference in the differences of perspective, what helps is to have kind of introduction. Hey, we need to schedule this conversation. Let's do this for 40 minutes. We will talk about this, and that. And then you go into conversation. So you eliminate those assumptions, you bring them down to the ground. And now people know how to understand the container that you can then flow with the content.
Thank you so much, Olga.
And it's
And I
okay to
think-
not be, understood. It's their problem. You're not responsible for their feelings. You're responsible for this percentage that you bring into this relationship, which means clarifying what you're going to talk about, why this is important, what are the emotions that you have, and it's your emotions, you own them, and what actions triggered this emotion in you, so they can associate and make decisions. You can also suggest the ideas. I would appreciate if you would next time do this, or that. You give them options of alternative behavior that they can then agree to. And one important piece is expectations versus agreements. Expectation is when you impose on them, I expect you to do dishes or do laundry or take the garbage out. It's your duty and I'm expecting. We put this in a very hierarchical mother-child relationship where the boss tells and the person, yes, ma'am, performs. While an agreement is explaining why, and they volunteer for this more. They agree into this, they sign into this agreement. It would really help me if you do this, this, and that, because this reasons, because I feel these reasons, and the agreement creates the responsibility on their side, and then it's on them. But it doesn't have to be in the form and shape and time frame of yours. It doesn't have to be now. It could be anytime between now and Friday. I expect your room to be picked up. But it gives them an opportunity to choose the shape, the form, the time, and a little bit more communication and respect in that instead of my way, highway.
Thank you.
I know that there was a question about your presentation, whether you're going to share it. And I would also like to just say my final comment is the importance of proactive communication. Instead of waiting until you're in conflict with someone that you work with, have those conversations. What is your style? What are your triggers? How do you like people to talk to you? When you're anxious, what do you tend to do? A lot of the conflict that I see can be addressed if people just had a proactive conversation. It's very difficult to be rational when you're in the midst of the firing range. It's very, very difficult.
And it's probably not the time at all. Let's survive the moment. But what you can do in this range of emotions, recognize the second you recognize and it's rising, you have an option to stop and literally postpone. You can always say, and you should always say, I feel angry right now. I don't think I can talk, or I'm ready to talk about this right now. Could we please continue this conversation at 7 o'clock or tomorrow or on Friday? That gives space and buffer between the emotions that you're going to explode to the place where you can cool down and have strategic place. Remember this: pause, then get present. And way to get present, immediately you can take a couple deep breaths and bring yourself neurologically to a slightly better place. Literally deep breath. 3 deep breaths will always put you in the place of better stress response, calm you down. The planning component is, we talked about this. What if there's a different story? What is the intent that they may have? What was the emotional response that I anticipate? What is the possible interest that they have? There is an intent and there is a story that probably drives 60% of the conflict. And that story is yours, only yours. It's only you could look at this and see a monster, or look at this and see, interesting, I've never seen this way. I'm curious, why do you see that? Right? And it's you who make this decision. So the story, the meaning, the intent of the person, intent that they might be doing this from a good place, recognizing there is some mechanism in place, the onion, like culture or societal norms or something else that you may not know, and ultimately recognizing and taking responsibility for your own emotional reactions. I'm too eager right now. What if I postpone it? Pause, present, plan, pursue.
I do want to thank you, Olga, for the kind invitation. And I want to thank all of you for your participation. It was really lovely. I do have lots of books. So I will give you a complimentary book if you send me a separate email. And I really do wish you all the best. Thank you, Olga. Again, I don't know if you want to say anything before we.
Thank you all very much. And I believe there is a whole series of internal resources that we will circulate to those who registered for this workshop. And I also know that Nadine is doing remarkable conversation tomorrow, I think, that I would like to invite everyone. And with that, thank you very much. But Nadine,
yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm doing a session called Minding the Gap. For those of you who have young people or older children who are going through mental distress, there will be a fabulous panel talking about how to get help tomorrow morning at 8 Eastern time. So we'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I hope everyone is enjoyed the conversation and got some new ideas and some ways of looking, and wishing you all the best. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you.